There's an important question I think all of us need to ask ourselves on a daily basis, or regularly at least, and that is, what kind of king do you want Jesus to be? Okay? There are all kinds of versions of Jesus, all kinds of views of Jesus, a lot of opinions, especially right now in the political world and in the religious circles. But the question comes down to this: what kind of king do you want Jesus to be? What's up, everybody? I'm Tyson Putoff, and this is scene 15 of the JesusX30 challenge, where we're trekking through the life and the messianic campaign of Jesus, following my 3-volume project, Jesus, the Strategic Life and Mission of the Messiah and His Movement. All 3 volumes are out right now in ebook and in print. Go find those on Amazon or on the publisher website or Barnes & Noble, or you can rent them for free through public library apps. Go ahead and get your copies and follow along. We're in scene 15, and there's a moment in Jesus's public campaign where the momentum really peaks. Okay, the crowds are huge, the miracles are flowing, and everyone around him seems to think that the time has come for him to push the revolution forward. Okay, everybody knows by now he's a revolutionary. He's leading a revolt. Okay, they just don't quite understand what kind of revolutionary he is, what kind of leader he is, what kind of king he is. And this is a moment we might expect Jesus to double down, to start organizing the movement into a real resistance. But instead, interestingly, what he does is the exact opposite of what we would expect. He walks away. There's this strange moment in scene 15, and it's the kind that kind of messes up our assumptions about what success is, what mission is, what it means to be successful in following Jesus, in leading our own branch of Jesus's movement, whether that's a church or some kind of a ministry or an organization. Because everything about this scene looks like a breakthrough. The people are ready, they're responding, they're energized, they're coming to Jesus from far away, and they're saying, "Hey, we know what you're up to. We're here to follow you." And even still, Jesus refused to let this movement become what they want it to be, if it doesn't align with the mission he is trying to establish. So let's set the scene a bit. It's the summer of 28 AD. Jesus and the 12 have just come off of a major turning point in his campaign. He sent the disciples out 2 by 2, and they've come back to report what happened. And they report healing and teaching and preaching and proclaiming Jesus as the founder of this new revolution. And they debrief. They're tired. Jesus is tired. He's just received the devastating news that his cousin, his friend, his mentor, John the Baptist, has been executed by Herod Antipas. And it's a stark reminder of the cost of public truth telling. It's the cost of following Jesus and walking in his footsteps. Even before the cross, the reality of sacrifice on the level of John the Baptist's sacrifice is becoming apparent to those around Jesus. So Jesus decides to take the group away, to debrief, to rest, and maybe to pray. And we've seen him do this before. Remember down in John 2, early in his public campaign, actually the first major moment in his campaign, about a year and a half ago during Passover of 27 AD, where Jesus went, criticized the temple, stirred it up, and then fled into the wilderness to talk to John the Baptist, and then went on back up into the Galilee where he's been for the last year. Well, he's done this before, and he's about to do this again, and that's take a retreat, kind of get out of the public eye. So Jesus and the disciples crossed the Sea of Galilee to the northeast side, up near Bethsaida-Julias, which puts them just outside of Herod Antipas's direct jurisdiction. Remember, the region is divided into 4 sections, each run by one of Herod the Great's sons. And Herod Antipas is the one that's really catching on to Jesus and who put John the Baptist to death. So Jesus gets out of his direct jurisdiction. And this is a remote area. It's on the edge of the region of Iturea. And it would have offered some degree of strategic distance from the pressure that's rising back in the Galilee. Okay. And the crowds aren't finished with Jesus, right? Word spreads fast. Thousands of people follow him on foot around the shoreline. The Sea of Galilee is like a giant lake. It's not that big. Like, you can walk around it. It'll take some time, but they can do it. And so these followers know that Jesus has fled. He and the disciples have retreated, and they're gonna follow him. And they're not just tourists, but they're desperate people. These are people living under Roman economic pressures, religious exhaustion, and political instability. And for many of these people, Jesus has become a symbol of hope. And he's intended to do that. He's trying to offer hope. If you go back and read, especially the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, which we talked about a few episodes ago, everything Jesus says and does is a statement of hope, especially for those who are poor, those who are sick, those who are hurting, those who are being pushed out of society and out of the religious circles and squashed by the politicians. So Jesus is a symbol of hope. And so he's got a lot of people following him. And he speaks with authority that people have yet to hear. He heals, he's compassionate, he's everything that they hope for in a leader who is representing God. And he's everything they've not experienced in their own leaders. And so when he tries to retreat, they come looking for him. And instead of being annoyed or overwhelmed, Jesus welcomes them, because still, you've got to understand, strategically, whether his people are with him or not, whether these crowds of followers are with him or not, it's the location that he's retreating from. He's getting out of Capernaum and these other areas to try to take some time away and regroup. They just happen to follow him to that place. And the Gospels tell us that he had compassion on them. He began to teach them and heal them. And as the day wears on, a practical problem arises. There's no food. The disciples are the first to raise the issue. And we're out in the middle of nowhere, they tell him. Send them away so they can go get something to eat. It's a reasonable suggestion because they're out in the middle of nowhere. People are hungry. Jesus and the disciples don't have anything in terms of food to offer them. And Jesus flips this situation on them and he says, hey, why don't you give them something to eat? And so, of course, they're confused. Jesus has a tendency to confuse his disciples sometimes. And their response is, how are we going to do this? We don't have any money. We don't have any resources. How are we going to feed a crowd of thousands? And someone mentions that over there is a boy with a few loaves of bread and 2 fish, barely enough for even the disciples to eat, let alone thousands. And Jesus says, okay, give it to me. So he blesses it, he breaks it, and he begins to distribute it. And what happens next is written about by all 4 gospel writers. Remember, there's 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and not all of them always record all events. This is one of them. And it turns out that the thousands of people in the audience following Jesus are fed. And not only are they fed, but they're filled. Like they go back for seconds and thirds, and there's still food left over. There's 12 basketfuls left over after this. And so you can imagine how shocked and how energized the crowd are. Not only did they just witness a miracle, but they were fed in the wilderness, no less. So for many of them, this moment would have evoked the stories of Moses and the Exodus. You remember the story, the people, the Israelites are out in the wilderness, in the desert. They're hungry, they're hot, they're tired. And alas, God feeds them with this mysterious bread from heaven called manna, called literally, what is it? And that same thing happens in a different form right here in this desolate place at the hands of Jesus. To a first century Jewish audience living under imperial oppression, this would have meant only one thing. The new Moses has arrived. The new deliverer has arrived. The one who was going to lead them out of exile. The one who would reclaim the throne of David. The one who would finally take back the kingdom that had been gone since the days of David and Solomon. And so the people do what people do when they think a movement is ready. They try to make it official. Remember this? In John tells us that they literally tried to seize Jesus and make him king by force. That's not just symbolic language, that's a serious political impulse. The crowd is ready to start something. Jesus has put himself in a position of political messianic leader. So he's given them a lot of the fuel for this fire. He's done healings, he's done miracles, he's preached moving and powerful sermons. He's laid down a constitution for a new empire, a new kingdom, a new establishment that's going to overtake the world, and that they're to obey as citizens of this new empire. So he's done all of the homework for them. They're just putting the pieces together and they're saying, hey, this guy is a king. Let's make him king right now. All the pieces are in place and they're ready to rally. But Jesus doesn't accept the offer. He doesn't just reject it. In fact, he completely disappears. He withdrew away from everyone, including the disciples, and he withdraws to a mountain by himself. He doesn't just try to steer the crowd in a different direction. He doesn't sit there and tell parables to them like he does in other situations, because they're fired up and they're ready to declare him king. And by this, they wanted him to be the revolutionary leader that calls them to arms and marches into Jerusalem and starts a violent clash with the Roman overlords. That's what they want. It's not even that they want Jesus to be king. It's the type of king they want Jesus to be. And that's what we asked at the beginning. What kind of king do you want Jesus to be? This group right here that Jesus was healing and teaching and feeding, they wanted Jesus to be a violent, revolutionary king who would enforce his will on everyone in his way, who would make everyone who didn't believe in him, make everyone who didn't accept his ways, a prisoner, a political subject in advancement of what they believed would be the kingdom of God being brought down from heaven to earth. And Jesus disappears. He says he not only rejects it, but he gets the heck out of there by himself. He ascends a mountain. Okay. And this is where we really start to feel the deeper weight of the scene. So Jesus isn't just walking away because he's unsure of himself or because the excitement is getting to him and he's tired and he's been teaching and healing and feeding all day. He's walking away because he knows exactly who he is, and he also knows who he's not. He knows he's a king, but not that kind of king. He's not going to be a king made by force, and he's not going to be a king who takes up arms, calls his followers to take up arms, and marches into a city to establish his rule. That's not how it works. He's not going to let the crowd project their own messianic expectations onto him and remake him in their own image. He's not going to become the kind of king that they want, even if it means losing their support. We'll get to that in a minute. Because what they're asking for, a revolutionary, bread-giving warlord who can feed armies and crush Rome, it's not the kind of rule that he came to bring. This is a critically important moment in Jesus's public campaign. From the outside, it looks like a high point, right? Jesus has garnered enough movement and momentum and enthusiasm among his followers that they're ready to crown him king. He just has to kind of simmer their expectations because he needs to go to the cross and die for our sins and all of that. No, this is critically important because Jesus refuses to let his movement get hijacked by shallow hopes, by earthly expectations. This is the moment when Jesus says no to success as the world defines it. And that no becomes kind of a sifting. He's not interested in crowds for the sake of numbers. He's not trying to build a fan base. He's not trying to go viral and build a social media following that includes anyone and everyone. Yeah, everyone is welcome in his movement. But as we're going to see, he's not interested in having just anybody on his team, which goes against all of the, I think, evangelical and evangelistic ideas that we have about Jesus. But I'll show you in a minute. What he wants, what he's always wanted, is a community of people who understand what kind of kingdom this really is. Not one built on coercion or conquest, but on faith and on fidelity and faithfulness, and on a kind of power that actually looks like weakness to the world. Jesus doesn't want to be the kind of king who feeds people and then uses their hunger and generates anger among them against those who won't feed them or against those who oppose him and uses that to win their allegiance. He wants to be the kind of king who redefines kingship itself, who redefines what it actually means to be a leader of people. And that's a hard thing for us to accept, especially for people who are desperate. It was hard for those people that day, and it's hard for us too. And maybe that's why Jesus retreats, not just to avoid the crowd, but to pray, to reset up on that mountain. And that's what the Gospels say he does. He goes up the mountain alone to pray. The pattern here, again, echoes moments in Scripture when God meets people on mountaintops. Moses at Sinai, another throwback to the Exodus story. Elijah at Horeb. But this time, there's something different. Jesus isn't just receiving a word. As the king, he actually is preparing for battle. That's the irony of all of this. He retreats from a crowd trying to make him one type of king to ascend to a mountain to prepare, because as a different type of king, he knows he's about to go into a battle. So you remember this story. The disciples are heading across the lake. Jesus is up on the mountain and he sends them in a boat to go ahead and head out into the lake. So the disciples are in the boat. And this is interesting. We saw this in Matthew 8 in a previous scene, and now here again in Matthew 14, we see it again, and in John 6. Another storm arises on the sea. And here's what I think happened. In the previous scene, when the sea tried to devour the disciples, the sea attacked them. Okay, this storm came out of nowhere, chaos attacked, and the disciples were terrified, and Jesus put the storm into submission and silenced it with his words. You remember that? This time is basically round two of the battle between Jesus and the sea. And in this scene, I don't think the sea attacks them. I think Jesus starts the fight. See, in the ancient world, if you wanted to be known as a son of God, you had to go to battle against one particular enemy, right? You were usually a warrior. So in Babylonian stories about the gods, and in Canaanite stories about the gods, and Egyptian stories about the gods, and Hittite stories about the gods, the son of the god of the pantheon was responsible for securing the throne of the chief god of that pantheon. Okay? And even though they were biologically the son of the high God, they still had to prove themselves in battle in order to say, yes, I am worthy of the throne. I'm ready to take over from here. And the opponent that they always had to fight was the sea, or the deity of chaos, which was always represented in the form of a dragon or the sea. And it was in this battle where the son of the high god and the forces of chaos would meet, and the son would come out victorious, conquer the sea, conquer the dragon, conquer the forces of chaos, and then be recognized as the Son of God, worthy of sitting on the throne. That didn't mean that the Son of God wasn't the Son of God before, biologically, genealogically, but it just meant that they had to prove that they were ready to take over the throne. I'm not saying all of these myths about all of these gods and their struggle and sons of gods and all that, all these other gods were real. I'm just saying this is what people believed in the ancient world, whether you were in Babylon or in Canaan or in Egypt or in Asia Minor or where the Hittites and other people groups were. This was just what you believed about the sons of God, including Jesus' own disciples on some level. In the previous scene, when Jesus went to battle the forces of chaos in the sea, remember? The disciples' response was, in Matthew 8, what is this that even the wind and the sea submit to him? What they don't say is as telling as what they do say. Okay, what they don't say is anything about, wow, this is the Son of God who just conquered chaos. And Jesus catches that. He recognizes that they don't get it that first time around. And you notice what Jesus says in Matthew 8 in that first battle against the sea? He says, you have little faith. Why are you afraid? And so he decides, I've got to do this again. I've got to defeat chaos. I've got to go to battle against the sea and win it right in front of their eyes, because they need to understand who I am. See, Jesus isn't just going to come out sometimes and say, hey, I'm the Son of God. So he's got to prove it to them in a way that is familiar to them in their own world. And defeating the sea is one way to prove that you're a son of God, or the Son of God in Jesus's case. And so he does it. He goes up on the mountain and he starts the fight. He goes and he starts the storm, and it thrusts the sea into a violent fit of rage, and it starts to drown the disciples, and they're terrified again. And then what do you notice? What do you remember about this scene? This is the famous scene too. This is the scene where Jesus comes walking along in the water, and his disciples are terrified. Every time they see Jesus, they're terrified. It makes sense because in their world, the sea was the embodiment of chaos. It was alive, and it was not something to be messed with. It wasn't just water, but it was also the place where dead souls would go to rest. It was the abyss, kind of the opening to the underworld. And so when the disciples see Jesus coming, they have no idea. And that's why the language that they use, what is this? Is this a ghost? And they're crying out because they think that this dead soul of a sailor, or of a warrior, or of an evil person or something, is coming back out of the sea to claim them and drag them down with it. And so they're rightly terrified. And Jesus comes walking along, then he identifies himself. And notice what he says. He says, I am. He identifies himself using the name that God identifies himself with to Moses at the burning bush. I am that I am. Jesus says, I am. And Peter, of course, the impulsive one, he says, okay, Lord, if it's you, let me come out there and walk with you. Jesus says, come on out. Peter gets out, starts to walk. He's doing it. He's walking on water. He starts to get closer to Jesus. And notice what happens there. He sees the wind and the waves, and he becomes afraid. So he sees what you can imagine, these waves coming up around him and almost looking like the jaws of this dragon-like beast trying to consume him. And he becomes afraid, and he starts to sink. And Jesus reaches out, catches him in the water, and they get into the boat. And immediately the wind and the waves die down. The battle is gone. Jesus ends the fight. He puts it into submission one more time. And then notice their response at the end of Matthew 14. How did the disciples respond? Check it out. Surely this is the Son of God. There it is. They get it. They get it. That's the kind of king Jesus is. Jesus is the kind of king who goes to battle against the forces of chaos that have thrust all humans into disarray. He's not the kind of king who goes and destroys one set of humans in favor of another set of humans. He's not the kind of king who goes in and kills Romans because they're Romans. He's the type of king who goes into battle against the forces of chaos that have thrust all of humanity and all of creation into disorder. He's going to battle on a cosmic realm, and we're sitting here and asking him to be a king on a human realm. And he says, no, that's not the kind of king I am. And this is fascinating too. The language that Matthew uses to describe Jesus walking on the water starts to fill in the details for the disciples. Matthew actually describes this using the same language that Job uses of God walking on the sea, trampling on the backs of the sea. And you'll read this in the Psalms, you'll read this in Job, you'll read this in the prophets. So in this moment, Jesus not only aligns himself with these and sort of says, hey, I'm that type of king, but he says, I am the Son of God and I am God himself. I am the God of Job. I am the God of the psalmist who tramples on the back of the sea, who puts this dragon of chaos into submission and sets you free. So after all of this, they ride the rest of the ride. I don't know what that conversation was like, and it was probably complete silence as they're trekking back to the other side. And they land in Gennesaret, and Jesus continues to heal people. The text even says that he is healing these crowds even by the fringes of his garment, his tzitzit, or the tassels of his garment. People are clamoring to get to him. They're just trying to get close enough to touch him because they know the power of this man is beyond anything they can ever explain. Even his touch heals them. But Jesus keeps going. The next day, they're back in Capernaum. So they've taken this short little retreat. Jesus demonstrated that he is the type of king who goes to battle against chaos. He's that type of king. He's the Son of God. He's God, the God of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Next day, they're back in Capernaum, John 6. And the crowds catch up again. They've seen the feeding. The ones who weren't there on the other side of the lake during that feeding of the 5,000, they're hearing the rumors and they're telling the stories, but they're hungry again. the food only lasts one day. So they're back, they're hungry again. They want to see Jesus do this again. And Jesus confronts them because he knows that the last time they did it, yeah, he provided something that they needed. But he also knows that they misunderstood the type of king that he actually is after he did that for them. And so he says, no, not this time. He says, you're looking for me, but you're not looking for me because you understood the signs, but instead you're looking for me because you ate the bread and you were filled. You were satisfied. He knows what they're after. He knows they want more food. He knows they want more miracles. They want a Messiah, a king who gives them what they want. And this is where, as I mentioned a little while ago, Jesus makes some statements that essentially says, I understand that my following is too big at this point for what we're about to experience. So he thins the herd. This is a sifting moment where Jesus makes a claim and he does so with the intent that some of them in the crowd, some of his followers are going to find this too hard to stick around and they're going to dissipate. And it's going to thin the crowd. At this point, he only wants those who are going to stick with him when the going gets tough, and the going's about to get really tough in this next few months for Jesus as he heads toward the cross. So he says, hey, I've got something else for you. I am the bread of life. And this is, he goes into his, what we call his bread of life sermon in John 6. But then what he ends up saying is really kind of gross. He starts to get really intense about his language. And he says that you guys must eat my flesh and drink my blood. And he uses the language of cannibalism almost. And it's offensive to a lot of people and they leave. Jesus even says that he uses the word when he's describing them eating his flesh, the word gnaw. You're going to gnaw on my flesh. It's really graphic. It's really intense. It's really bold. And the crowd naturally, most of them in the crowd recoil and they go away. And this had to be hard for Jesus to see because he understands he wants everyone to follow him, but he also at the same time understands that not everybody is interested in following a king of his nature. And the only followers he wants to stick around are those who are interested in following him as the type of king that he really is. And it's a tough message. And you're not going to hear this preached very often. And you're not going to hear this in a church plant where they're just trying to get as many people as they can get. And you're not going to hear this in a lot of Sunday school lessons and devotionals, but there's a reality to the type of king Jesus is versus the type of king Jesus wants. And he wants everyone to follow him, but he also expects that if you're going to follow him, you have to embrace the type of king that he actually is. And by doing that, you also have to embrace the methods that he employs for his own reign, and also the methods that he expects his own followers to employ in the way they live their lives, including you and me. They came for bread, they got a cross. They wanted a violent king, they got a king, but he's everyone's king. They wanted a king who would go to battle against their enemies. He's saying, you need to figure out how to get along because I'm battling a much bigger enemy that's trying to destroy you all. And John tells us that many of the disciples turned back and no longer followed Jesus at this point. These weren't just random onlookers. John literally says disciples, a lot of the disciples. So there were more than 12 disciples at this point. Jesus had his formal 12, his apostles, but there were a lot of disciples at this point. And John says that a lot of his disciples turned and left. These weren't just random fans of Jesus. These were people who had been following him, had been learning from him, had been sitting at his feet. People who had seen his miracles and believed in him. And they knew to a certain degree what and who he was at this point. But when the teaching got hard and when the calling got difficult, when the kingdom didn't match their expectations, they bounced, they walked. And Jesus doesn't chase them. Notice that? He turns to the 12 and he says, hey, you guys gonna leave too? That's when Peter, of course, who had just been almost drowned in the sea a day earlier, gives maybe his finest moment so far. He says, Lord, where else would we go? You have the words of eternal life. It's not a perfect confession. It's not bold. It's not triumphant, but it's honest. We don't understand everything, but we understand enough to stay. And sometimes that's discipleship. And I think scene 15 gives us two pictures of momentum. You've got the crowds with their energy ready to crown Jesus as this violent king who's going to defend them, defend their religious rights, defend their rights to free speech. He's going to defend them at all costs and march them in and call them up to arms. And then you've got this king who is doing battle against a much more formidable foe in the forces of chaos. And he's saying, I need you guys to get along because this force is trying to destroy you all. One group understood power, one group didn't. And one group, the smaller group, understood who Jesus truly was, or at least began to understand who he was and didn't walk away when things got tough. And I think if we're honest, many of us prefer the first half of the story. We like the bread, the success, the crowds. We like a violent king who loves us and forgives us, but who destroys our enemies. But the deeper question is whether we're willing to follow him when he heads into the storm, when he draws us into the storm too, and says, I'm not asking you to fight. I'll do the fighting. You just stay in the boat and be faithful to me. Jesus doesn't need fans. He's not forming a social media following. He's not looking to be famous. He's not looking to be popular. He's forming partners, sons and daughters, who will walk into the storm with him, who will face down the powers of chaos and death and still stay in the boat even when we're terrified and defenseless. And he's asking us not to take up arms and follow a king into battle. He's asking us to lay down our arms, get in the boat, and follow the king into chaos. That's the kind of kingdom he's building. That's the kind of king he is. And that's the choice he's giving you and me right now. Leku Ahmad, go and learn. Come back for scene 16 of the JesusX30 challenge.